They told me that being alone in old age was something to fear. They said silence would swallow me, that the nights would grow longer, colder, emptier. But no one warned me about the quiet joy. No one told me that peace could live in the stillness, that solitude, once dreaded, could become sacred. This is not a story of loneliness. It's a story of becoming, of returning to myself. Because somewhere between the noise of the past and the expectations of others, I found something waiting in the quiet. Something I never knew I needed, my own peace. I remember the day my last child moved out, how the house seemed to echo with absence, how I wandered from room to room, touching photographs, straightening cushions, filling the space with movement because stillness felt too final, too empty. And when night fell, I turned on every lamp, every television, afraid of what the quiet might reveal. Many of you know this feeling. The moment when your role shifts, when the identities you've worn for decades, parent, partner, provider, begin to loosen around the edges. When you suddenly find yourself face to face with a person you've known all your life, but haven't truly met yourself. So many of us were taught that being alone means being forgotten. That silence is what happens when the world moves on without us. But what if we've been looking at solitude through the wrong lens all along? What if being alone isn't an ending, but a beginning? At 73, I've discovered truths in solitude that decades of noise concealed from me. Revelations that arrived not in thunderclaps of insight, but in whispers that could only be heard when everything else grew quiet. Perhaps you're standing at the threshold of your own solitude, whether by choice or circumstance. Or maybe you're already walking this path, wondering if the peace others speak of will ever find you. If the moments of loneliness will ever transform into something more nourishing. I'm here to tell you what I wish someone had told me. There is wisdom waiting in the quiet. There is a fullness in emptiness that can only be discovered by staying with it, by learning its language, by refusing to run from its embrace. This is what I found in living alone at 73. This is the peace I never knew before. Silence isn't empty, it's full of truth. The first thing I noticed when I began living alone was the silence. Not just the absence of other voices, but the strange amplification of sounds I'd never paid attention to before. The subtle creak of floorboards beneath my feet, the rhythm of rain against the windows, the way my house seemed to breathe and settle as the day's heat released into evening coolness. In our noisy world, we're taught to fear silence, to fill it with podcasts, television, phone calls, anything to avoid the discomfort of our own uninterrupted thoughts. For weeks, I did exactly this. I kept the radio playing in every room, scheduled too many coffee dates, called my children daily. Not always because I had something to say, but because I was afraid of what might rise to the surface if I didn't keep the waters of my mind constantly rippled. But then, one afternoon, during a power outage, I found myself sitting by the window as dusk gathered. No lights, no background hum of appliances, just the gradual deepening of shadows and the occasional call of a distant bird. And something strange happened. Instead of panic, I felt a release, a settling, as if my body had been holding its breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. In that silence, I heard my own thoughts with a clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. Not the rehearsed thoughts I shared with others, but the deeper current moving beneath them. The hopes that still remained unspoken. The fears I'd never acknowledged. The permission to feel exactly what I was feeling without needing to translate it for another person's understanding. In silence, I hear things I never noticed before. My thoughts, my body, my longings. When no one is around to fill the space, what remains is yourself. And that is enough. I've come to believe that silence isn't empty at all. It's full of truth. Not just about the world, but about ourselves. The parts of us that get drowned out by constant noise and distraction. The wisdom that can only find voice when we create space for it to speak. Does this sound familiar? Have you ever noticed how a quiet morning feels different from a busy one? How thoughts arise differently when they're not competing with a dozen other stimuli? This isn't coincidence. It's our minds finally having room to process, to integrate, to understand. Keep watching. The next insight may surprise you. Because what I discovered next about living alone changed everything. Freedom is subtle, but it's everything. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes with solitude, one I never anticipated. It's not the dramatic freedom we see in movies, where characters throw caution to the wind and embark on grand adventures. It's quieter, more intimate, and in many ways more profound. I eat when I'm hungry. I rest when I'm tired. No one hurries me. No one interrupts the slow rhythm I've earned. Freedom doesn't always feel loud. It often arrives as gentle permission to be yourself. I remember the first time I truly recognized this freedom. I was standing in my kitchen at 10:30 at night, eating ice cream straight from the container. Not because I was being rebellious or indulgent, but simply because I wanted ice cream, and there was no reason not to have it. No one would comment on my choices. No one would suggest alternatives or remind me about my cholesterol or make me feel self-conscious about my nighttime cravings. It sounds small, doesn't it? Eating ice cream whenever you want. But in that moment, I felt a rush of something that can only be described as joy, not because of the ice cream itself, but because I was experiencing, perhaps for the first time in decades, what it means to follow my own internal rhythms without negotiation, explanation, or compromise. This is the subtle freedom of solitude, the release from constant accommodation. For most of my life, I adjusted myself to fit with others, their schedules, their preferences, their needs. I woke when my husband woke, ate when my children were hungry, rested when the household finally quieted. Even my thoughts aligned themselves with the expectations around me. But in solitude, these external patterns fall away. You discover the natural flow of your own energy. When you genuinely feel tired, when you naturally become hungry, which activities truly rejuvenate you versus which ones you've been performing out of habit or obligation. I found that my body knows things my mind often ignores. It knows when it needs rest, when it craves movement, when it hungers for silence or connection. Living alone has allowed me to listen to this wisdom without filtering it through another person's needs or timeline. Some mornings I wake at dawn, make tea, and watch the world awaken from my porch. Other mornings I stay in bed until 9, reading or simply watching the play of light across my ceiling. Neither choice requires justification. Neither pattern needs to be consistent. This isn't laziness or indulgence. It's alignment with my true nature after years of external scheduling. Decisions that once seemed trivial now reveal themselves as expressions of autonomy. What to eat, when to sleep, how to arrange the furniture, which music to play, whether to speak aloud or remain silent. In the absence of compromise, each choice becomes an affirmation. This is who I am. This is what I prefer. This is how I choose to live. Even the space itself transforms. My home is no longer a negotiated territory, but a direct expression of my inner landscape. The reading nook by the eastern window where morning light streams in. The absence of a television in the living room because I prefer the quality of silence. The collection of blue glass bottles on the windowsill that serve no purpose except that their color brings me joy. This freedom extends beyond the physical into the emotional and spiritual. I cry when I need to cry without worrying about concerning others. I laugh aloud at my own thoughts. I pray in my own way, on my own schedule, without conforming to anyone else's religious conventions or expectations. I found that in this gentle liberation, creativity reawakens. Not necessarily in grand artistic endeavors, but in the small, daily expressions of being alive. I write letters I never send. I sing in the shower without lowering my voice. I experiment with recipes without worrying about anyone else's preferences or allergies. And yes, sometimes this freedom reveals its shadow side. There are evenings when I miss the pleasant constraint of cooking for someone else, the way their presence would nudge me toward healthier choices or more regular habits. Freedom, like everything meaningful, carries both light and weight. But even in these moments of contrast, I recognize the gift. Because this freedom has taught me something essential, that I can trust myself, that my own internal guidance is sufficient, that the rhythm of my life doesn't require external validation to be worthy or correct. Notice this in yourself or someone you care about. The way they stand taller when they're following their own inner compass. The light that enters their eyes when they speak of choices made from authentic desire rather than obligation. This isn't selfishness, it's selfhood. And it may be one of the most precious discoveries that solitude offers. I've let go of the need to please. Perhaps the most unexpected peace I've found in solitude comes from the gradual release of a burden I didn't even realize I was carrying: the constant, exhausting need to please others. I used to shape myself to fit into rooms, into roles, into expectations. But living alone taught me that I don't need to be understood by everyone, just by myself. There's peace in no longer needing approval. Looking back, I can see how much of my life was spent in careful navigation of other people's feelings and judgments. The slight adjustments in my opinions to avoid conflict. The smiles maintained through fatigue. The preferences set aside so often they eventually became invisible, even to me. It wasn't just with family, though certainly there. It was everywhere. With neighbors, with church members, with casual acquaintances at the grocery store. A lifetime of smoothing edges, of making myself palatable, of ensuring no one would find me difficult or demanding. I don't think I'm alone in this. Many of us, especially women of my generation, were taught that our highest calling was to maintain harmony, to keep others comfortable, to be, above all things, agreeable. We became experts at reading rooms, at anticipating needs, at sacrificing our own truth in service of someone else's ease. The first year living alone, I still carried these habits with me. I would catch myself rehearsing conversations before phone calls, carefully constructing my words to avoid any possible offense. I would feel guilty about decisions no one else would ever even know about. Wearing the same comfortable clothes 3 days in a row, or letting dishes sit in the sink overnight. But gradually, in the absence of an audience, these patterns began to loosen their grip. Without the immediate feedback of others' reactions, the machinery of people-pleasing began to show itself for what it was: an elaborate system built on fear rather than love. I remember the day I realized I was no longer performing. I was on a call with my daughter, and she asked about my weekend plans. Without thinking, I told her I was looking forward to attending a documentary screening at the community center. A film about political activism that would have raised eyebrows in my former social circle. Only after we hung up did I realize I hadn't weighed my words, hadn't considered whether she would approve or disapprove. I had simply spoken my truth. It felt like taking off a corset I'd worn for decades. Suddenly, I could breathe all the way down to my belly. This doesn't mean I've become inconsiderate or stopped caring about others' feelings. But there's a world of difference between compassion and people-pleasing. One comes from abundance, the other from fear. One respects both yourself and others, the other ultimately respects neither. Living alone has taught me that I don't need universal approval to feel worthy. That disagreement doesn't have to mean rejection. That I can listen to dissenting viewpoints without automatically abandoning my own. I've watched this same transformation in friends who have embraced solitude. How their voices gradually become more authentic. How they stop apologizing for having preferences. How they begin making choices based on internal values rather than external validation. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who don't truly know you because you've never shown them your undivided self. It's a loneliness that can exist in a crowded room, in a busy household, in a decades-long marriage. And there's a particular kind of connection with yourself and eventually with others that becomes possible only when you stop fragmenting yourself to fit others' expectations. Comment below if this resonates with your journey. I've found that these quiet realizations are often the most universally felt, yet the least frequently discussed. Loneliness and solitude are not the same. Let me be clear, living alone is not without its challenges. There are still nights when the silence feels too empty. Mornings when I wish for the comfort of familiar footsteps in the hallway. Moments of accomplishment or beauty that seem somehow diminished without someone to share them. Loneliness aches, solitude nourishes. The first is a hunger, the second is a home. What changed wasn't my surroundings, but how I chose to see them. I've come to understand that loneliness and solitude, though often confused, are fundamentally different experiences. Loneliness is the painful awareness of absence, a feeling of disconnection, of missing something essential. Solitude, on the other hand, is presence, a state of being completely with yourself, attentive to your own existence without distraction. The same evening can contain both. I might sit at my dining table, eating a meal I've prepared with care, and feel a wave of loneliness wash over me. A wish that someone sat across from me, sharing this food and this moment. But if I stay with that feeling, not running from it or trying to numb it with noise, it often transforms. The awareness shifts from what's missing to what's present. The flavors on my tongue, the satisfaction of nourishment, the privilege of choosing exactly what I want to eat and how I want to prepare it. This is the practice, perhaps the central practice, of living peacefully alone, learning to transform loneliness into solitude through the alchemy of attention. It doesn't always work. There are days when loneliness wins, when no amount of mindful presence can fill the human-shaped space that sometimes aches in my life. On those days, I've learned not to judge myself, to recognize that longing for connection is not weakness, but evidence of our fundamentally social nature. But I've also discovered that these periods of loneliness, when met with gentleness rather than resistance, often reveal their own gifts. They clarify which relationships truly nourish me and which merely filled space. They inspire me to reach out with greater authenticity. They remind me that meaningful connection cannot be replaced by mere proximity. The paradox is this: it was only in learning to be truly alone that I discovered how to be genuinely connected. When interaction became a choice rather than a constant condition, I found myself engaging from a place of wholeness rather than need. My relationships, though fewer in number, grew deeper in quality. I no longer spend time with people out of habit or convenience or fear of empty hours. I choose connection deliberately, meaningfully, with full awareness of its value. And in between these connections, I return to the rich territory of solitude, not as a consolation prize, but as its own worthy destination. For those walking this path, I offer this perspective: what feels like loneliness today may reveal itself as freedom tomorrow. Not because the feeling itself transforms, but because your relationship to it changes. Because you begin to recognize that being alone with yourself is not a punishment, but an opportunity to discover the one relationship that will sustain you through every other coming and going in your life. I hear the world differently now. One of the most unexpected gifts of solitude has been a gradual reawakening of my senses, as if the absence of constant human interaction has created space for other forms of communication to emerge. Birdsong in the morning, the hum of the kettle, even my own breath has become a kind of companion. When you stop racing, you begin to receive what's always been there. Before living alone, I moved through the world in a state of partial attention, always alert to others' needs, always processing conversations, always planning what to say next or wondering what had been meant by what was just said. Even in quieter moments, my mind remained crowded with social calculations and lingering emotions from human exchanges. But as the weeks and months of solitude accumulated, I noticed a shift. Without the constant processing of human interaction, my awareness began to expand in other directions. Sounds I had filtered out for years suddenly came into focus. The different tones of rain, soft on leaves, sharp on windows, muted on soil. The specific creak of the third stair that announces a change in weather. The layered symphony of evening insects that changes subtly with the seasons. This heightened listening extends beyond sound. I noticed the shifting quality of light throughout the day in a way I never did before. How the morning sun creates entirely different shapes and colors than the afternoon glow. I feel subtle changes in temperature against my skin. I taste food more completely without the distraction of conversation. There's a richness to this sensory awareness that feels almost like having new companions. The cardinal that visits my feeder each morning is no longer just a bird, but a specific presence with recognizable habits and sounds. The ancient oak outside my window is not merely scenery, but a living entity whose and movements I've come to recognize and anticipate. This isn't mysticism or loneliness-induced anthropomorphism. It's simply what becomes available to perception when we quiet the constant human chatter that normally occupies the foreground of awareness. I've come to believe that much of what we call loneliness in our society is actually a form of sensory deprivation. Disconnection not just from other humans, but from the living world that surrounds us. We've been taught that only human communication matters, that nature is merely backdrop, that the non-human world is essentially inert. Living alone has taught me otherwise. It has shown me that we exist within a constant field of communication, that the world is speaking all the time, in an infinite variety of languages, if only we would learn to listen. This doesn't replace human connection, but it does complement it, supplement it, sometimes even heal the places where human relationship has left wounds or gaps. On winter evenings when darkness comes early and the hours stretch long before bedtime, I no longer experience the same restless emptiness I once did. Instead, I've learned to turn my attention to the subtle symphony of my home. The different voices of the wind through different windows, the conversation between the radiator and the old wooden floors as they expand and contract with heat, the distinctive sound of branches against the roof that tells me exactly which way the wind is blowing. There is company in this attention. There is relationship. There is a kind of love that grows not from projection or need but from patient observation and genuine interest. And strangely, this expanded listening has enhanced my human connections as well. I find myself bringing the same quality of attention to conversations that I've learned to bring to birdsong or rainfall. I listen not just for content but for tone, for rhythm, for the spaces between words. I notice subtle shifts in expression that would have once slipped past my awareness. The world speaks in whispers most of the time. Living alone has taught me how to hear them. Memory feels softer in stillness. One of the unexpected mercies of solitude has been a gradual shift in my relationship with the past, with its difficulties, its regrets, its might-have-beens. Old regrets don't shout as much when I sit by the window and watch the afternoon light change. I don't replay everything anymore. I just let it float through me like music, not demand answers like it used to. For much of my life, memory has been a kind of ambush. Moments from the past suddenly seizing me in the midst of ordinary tasks. The argument I should have handled differently 30 years ago. The opportunity I didn't recognize until it was too late. The hurtful words I can't unsay. The tender words I never managed to speak. These recollections would arrive with a physical force that demanded immediate attention. A tightening in my chest, a flush of heat across my face, a sickening drop in my stomach. And they would trigger an exhausting cycle of mental examination, justification, and regret that could consume hours of inner life, while barely registering on the outside. But something changes in sustained solitude. Without the constant stream of new social inputs, new slights to analyze, new tensions to navigate, new reactions to interpret, the past gradually loses some of its power to hijack the present moment. It's not that memories fade. If anything, they become more accessible, more complete. But their emotional grip loosens. They begin to feel less like indictments requiring defense, and more like stories that happened to someone I once was. Someone I can now regard with compassion rather than judgment. I noticed this most in the late afternoons, that traditionally difficult time once called the hour of lead, by poets more eloquent than I. I sit by my eastern window as the light begins its subtle shift toward evening, and I allow memories to arise without chasing or resisting them. My daughter's wedding day, when joy was complicated by awareness of my own failed marriage, the career I abandoned to care for my ailing mother, with all its unlived possibilities, the love I didn't recognize until it had already departed, the harsh words spoken in moments of fear that can never be unsaid. These memories still contain sadness, sometimes even pain. But in the spaciousness of solitude, they no longer demand resolution. They no longer insist that I defend or justify or rewrite them. They simply are. As much a part of the landscape of my life as the furniture in my home or the view from my window. I've come to believe that memory, like wine, needs space and stillness to mature properly. In the constant motion of a busy life, surrounded by others, our relationship with the past often remains reactive and unprocessed. We carry old wounds and regrets not because we're unwilling to release them, but because we never have the uninterrupted time and space required for this deeper work of integration. Living alone has given me this gift, the chance to finally digest my own history, to metabolize experiences that had remained frozen in time, preserved in their original emotional state for decades. This isn't about forgetting or dismissing the past. It's about allowing it to finally complete itself, to reveal its full meaning and take its proper place in the larger story of a life. I find that some memories actually become more vivid in this space, filled with details I hadn't previously registered. The exact quality of light on a significant morning, the precise tone of voice in which important words were spoken, the subtle kindnesses that went unacknowledged in more chaotic times. Other memories transform entirely, revealing dimensions and perspectives that were invisible to me when I was still embedded in the emotional dynamics that created them. Conflicts that once seemed entirely the fault of others now reveal my own contributions. Failures that felt like personal deficiencies now appear as inevitable outcomes of impossible situations. There's a gentleness to this process that feels like grace. Not the dramatic absolution of religious conversion, but the quiet mercy of finally being able to hold all parts of one's story. The beautiful and the broken, the wise and the foolish, in a single compassionate gaze. The most important voice is mine. Of all the discoveries solitude has brought me, perhaps the most profound has been the gradual recovery of my own inner voice. That quiet, steady presence that always knew what was true for me, what was right for me, what was needed for me, even when I couldn't hear it beneath the chorus of other influences. I've spent decades listening to others, family, friends, television, opinions. Now, I finally hear my own wisdom. It speaks slowly, kindly, with patience. It sounds like peace. This voice was never entirely absent, of course. It made itself known in moments of clarity throughout my life. Those rare instances when I knew with absolute certainty what I needed to do. Not because someone told me, or because I figured out logically, but because something deeper than thought simply knew. But these moments were islands in a sea of external guidance. Like many people, especially women of my generation, I was taught to look outside myself for direction. To parents, to teachers, to religious leaders, to spouses, to experts, to friends, to books, to societal expectations. I was taught that wisdom came from elsewhere, that my role was to receive and follow rather than to know and discern. Living alone has reversed this polarity. Without the constant input of others' opinions and reactions, without the subtle pressure to align my thoughts with prevailing views around me, my own inner knowing has gradually strengthened. Like a muscle finally being used after years of atrophy, I notice it in small decisions first: what to eat, what to wear, how to spend an afternoon. In the absence of others' preferences, I'm forced to consult my own, and to my surprise, they're quite clear when I actually listen for them. I discover that I've always known what nourishes me, what depletes me, what feels authentically aligned with who I am. I just rarely gave this knowledge priority over external considerations. But as the weeks and months pass, this inner guidance begins to speak on larger questions as well. How to approach my health as I age, what relationships deserve my limited energy, what legacy I want to leave, what constitutes a life well lived in its final chapters. I find myself making decisions that surprise my children, my friends. Not because they're radical or rebellious, but because they emerge from a source these others didn't know existed within me. A source I myself am only now becoming fully acquainted with. This inner voice doesn't speak in shoulds or musts. It doesn't deal in certainties or absolutes. It's not rigid or dogmatic or judgmental. It's gentle but clear, flexible but grounded, humble but unafraid. It's teaching me to trust myself in a way I never fully could before. Not with the naive self-confidence of youth, which is often just bravado masking insecurity, but with the earned self-reliance that comes from actually living through enough to know that I can handle whatever comes next. I'm learning that this voice has always been my truest guide, even when I couldn't hear it clearly. That the moments in my life I most regret were precisely those when I ignored its quiet counsel in favor of louder, more insistent external voices. And that the decisions I'm most grateful for, even when they led through difficulty, were those that came from this deeper knowing. Comment below if this resonates with your journey. I suspect many of you have felt this too. The gradual recovery of your own wisdom as the noise of the world grows a little quieter around you. Because here's what I've come to believe. We all have this voice within us, but hearing it requires a kind of silence that our society rarely encourages or permits. It requires the courage to temporarily set aside others' expectations and opinions. It requires the willingness to listen for the quietest voice in the room, the one that doesn't shout for attention, but simply waits to be recognized. Living alone has given me the space to finally hear it clearly, to distinguish it from the internalized voices of parents, teachers, partners, and a culture that often tells us who we should be rather than asking us who we are. And in that hearing, I found a peace I never knew before. Not the fragile peace that comes from having everything under control or having everyone's approval, but the deeper peace that emerges from being in alignment with my own truth. Whatever the external circumstances may be, I didn't set out to live alone, but in doing so, I found a wholeness I never expected. Not because life became perfect, but because I stopped running from myself. So if you're walking this path too, know this: solitude isn't a punishment. Sometimes, it's a gift wrapped in silence, waiting to be unwrapped slowly, softly, honestly. There are still difficult days, of course. Days when the silence feels too heavy, when I miss the simple comfort of shared meals and casual conversation, when I long for a hand to hold or a shoulder to lean on. Solitude is not a permanent solution to the complexity of human longing. It doesn't erase our need for connection or touch or belonging. But what it offers, at least what it has offered me, is a foundation of self-knowledge and self-acceptance that makes all other connections more authentic, more nourishing, more sustainable. It has taught me that I can be whole on my own, that my worth isn't determined by my usefulness to others, that my happiness doesn't depend on constant external validation. And strangely, paradoxically, this inner sufficiency has made me more available for genuine connection, not less. Because I no longer approach relationships from a place of desperation or need, but from a place of wholeness and choice. I can offer my presence as a gift rather than seeking others' presence as a necessity. If you find yourself entering a season of solitude, whether by choice or by circumstance, I hope you'll receive it not as an exile but as an invitation. An invitation to finally hear the wisdom that has been speaking within you all along. An invitation to discover what peace feels like when it rises from within rather than depending on external conditions. This journey isn't always easy. There will be nights when loneliness feels overwhelming, days when you question everything, moments when you wonder if you've made a terrible mistake in choosing this path or having it chosen for you. In those moments, remember this: the discomfort you feel isn't solitude itself, but the space between the person you've been and the person you're becoming. It's the necessary darkness between what was and what will be. And if you can stay with it, neither running from it nor trying to fix it, it will gradually reveal its purpose. If this reflection has touched something in you, I'd be grateful to hear your thoughts. Your journey may be different from mine, shaped by different circumstances, different challenges, different discoveries. But I suspect there's a thread that connects all our experiences of learning to be at home with ourselves. A recognition that transcends the specifics of our individual stories. If you've found value in these words, perhaps they've helped you feel less alone in your own experience. And if that's the case, I hope you'll consider subscribing to join this quiet community of fellow travelers. Not because numbers matter, but because genuine connection does. Even when it happens across the distance of screens and time zones. And if something specific resonated with you, or if you have your own wisdom to share about the journey of solitude, please leave a comment below. Your words may be exactly what another person needs to hear today. A reminder that we're never truly alone in our experiences, even when we walk separate paths. We're never truly alone, not when we begin to belong to ourselves. And in that belonging, we discover a peace that no external circumstance can grant or take away. A peace that rises from within like a well that was always there, just waiting to be uncovered. This is the gift of solitude, when we receive it with open hands and an open heart. This is the peace I never knew before. And it's waiting for you too, in the quiet spaces between the noise. In the gentle return to yourself,